All right. Good morning, everybody, and thank you all for joining. I'd like to welcome everybody to the 6th Watershed Wednesday. This is Emily D. Carr. I'm the Ag Coordinator for the Upper Susquehanna Coalition. Watershed Wednesdays are hosted by the Upper Susquehanna Coalition and the Otsego County Conservation Association. These weekly sessions are taking place of the Upper Susquehanna Watershed Forum for 2020 since we're unable to meet in person. We currently have 2 more sessions scheduled for the month of August. That schedule will be posted at the end of today's session, but also keep an eye on our website and Facebook page for announcements for future sessions moving forward into the fall. To get things started today, our presenter is Melissa Urich from the Usc Wetland Team, and she's going to give you an overview of some of the wetland restoration that's happening around the watershed.
Hey, good morning. It's my pleasure to share with you about wetland restoration in the Upper Susquehanna watershed today. And so to start, I wanted to go over what wetland restoration is. Here are a couple different definitions. Restoration is actually returning a degraded wetland or a former wetland to a pre-existing condition or as close as possible to that condition. Creation, a different type of restoration in the restoration category, is where you're actually converting a non-wetland area to a wetland. An enhancement is increasing one or more wetland functions in an existing wetland beyond what is currently or previously present. In the background of this picture, you can see a golf course, so definitely not an existing wetland, but it's something that after a little bit of site work, we were able to turn into a wetland. You can see in the very back behind this word wetland here, we've got 3 pine trees standing, and here we are just 3 years later, a really nice functioning wetland system, just with a little bit of restoration. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So why are we worried about wetlands? Mainly because wetlands offer an awful lot of benefits. Wetlands are considered crucial in detaining runoff and floodwater, improving water quality, increasing biodiversity, and promoting water infiltration, which is definitely an important benefit in areas where there's a lot of drought or when we have such differing amounts of rainfall coming throughout our seasons, as we've been observing lately. Here's a really interesting chart showing that the more wetlands you have in a watershed, the less flood flow you have. And we consider this 10% mark here to be the key mark. When we have 10% of a watershed in wetlands, we wind up with 50% less flooding. So you can see really any additional percentage of wetlands you have, that peak flow decreases sharply. So in our opinion, the more wetlands we have, the better everything is as far as decreasing flooding and maintaining our landscape. Improving water quality is a critical role of wetlands. Wetland plants connect to the filter, trapping nutrients, trapping sediment. Water goes into the ground, where the ground then acts as additional filter. And wetlands are known as nature's kidney. And wildlife. Anybody who loves being outdoors is familiar with all the animals and plants that require wildlife. And in fact, all amphibians require wetlands for at least their breeding phase of their life cycle. And at least 15% of migratory birds use wetland habitats. And many, many endangered species are reliant on wetland habitats as well. So we're talking about wetlands because, of course, there aren't nearly as many as there used to be. This chart shows the percentage of wetlands across the state that have been destroyed since the 1780s. New York State's pretty high, but not the highest, but we are at 60% of our wetlands have been destroyed. And another reason why we're interested in wetlands is because the Chesapeake Bay, that's something that is really central to the Upper Susquehanna Coalition focus. And we're really concerned about nutrient and sediment runoff to the Chesapeake Bay, and that's really a driver behind most of the work that we do. And wetlands are considered an integral BMP, or best management practice, at reducing nutrient and sediment runoff. And therefore, by implementing these practices, we wind up with credits in the Chesapeake Bay model that show them that we're working hard to improve our water quality. Here's some slides from Chesapeake Bay websites where they're focusing on wetland restoration and the importance of them. All right, so historically, there were an awful lot of wetlands. We saw the chart showing 60% of New York State's wetlands have been destroyed. And people don't really realize how that happens, except that there were many, many wetlands on the landscape before, and through management practices or construction, they've been removed. And that's why adding those wetlands back on the landscape is so much more important now. This is an interesting aerial photo showing 1938, part of Chemung County, where we had significant amount of clearing for all sorts of land uses. But we find that in recent years, these areas have grown back to forest. So the clearing that occurred in those areas to promote different land uses, it's no longer functional, it's no longer necessary, as so much of this land is now back into forest cover. And so going in and restoring those areas is pretty important. Wetland restoration, as we currently define it, has been actively happening in our watersheds since the 1980s, with Ducks Unlimited and USDA NRCS beginning the charge. But the Upper Susquehanna Coalition has started, we started actually in 2002, and we've been working steadily ever since. There are many, many different types of wetland restoration. Using ditch plugs is one of the easiest ways to restore an area to a wetland. They're excellent tools for restoring wetlands, and in many cases, areas with ditches were originally wetlands. And by plugging the ditches and preventing the drainage of that water, hydrology levels in surrounding areas are elevated, ensuring saturation and standing water and increased water residence time at the site. Ditch plugs are also some of the easiest things to construct, because pretty much you're just building a mini berm in the path of the ditch and detaining the water, keeping it on site. This is an aerial photo showing a spot where we were identifying another ditch plug being needed because we had constructed a ditch plug around these conifers, and we were seeing subsurface drainage across the land towards this ditch that we had not impounded. And so by adding a ditch plug here, we were able to impound a lot more water. And then this site was actually constructed really with the construction of 3 separate ditch plugs. That's all it took to restore about 40 acres of a former golf course. There was a larger ditch plug further down the ditch channel here. And ditch plugs are as simple, as I said, as putting a plug in the path of the ditch and holding that water in it and not letting it escape like it wants to. Water likes to run downhill, so adding those impediments to it, it forces it to find other ways, which means it's traveling through the ground instead of over the ground or through the ditches. Another method for restoring wetlands is by constructing berms. And with suitable site contours and soils, earthen berms can be constructed from material on site that impound shallow water over large areas. Wetlands constructed with berms often have some open water in front of them, where soil was borrowed for construction, but generally shallow water with an abundance of plant growth is the target for wetland restoration. Plants equal habitat. So using heavy machinery to construct berms is definitely a go-to restoration tool. Just ensuring that you're identifying any subsurface drainage by building a core trench under the berm, making sure that the soil is suitable with high enough clay content, and that your machinery is compacting the soil enough with 6 to 12-inch lifts where you're compacting over top of soil mounded to build the berm. Another method of restoration is building potholes. And potholes are suitable options for construction in areas where berms would not result in additional impoundment, where slopes are low, or in some cases where soils have low clay content. In those areas, usually the potholes would be constructed in conjunction with a ditch plug where you're raising the overall water level across the site, and then you're excavating down to that water level using machines. And then it's important to haul the material off-site so that you're not resulting in mounds and excessive mounds next to the wetlands. Sometimes potholes are more appropriate for wetland enhancement projects, where it's a site that is already a wetland, but because of past management, it's really been flattened and leveled out, and it's wound up being a monoculture of cattails or some other species that really doesn't promote diversity. So adding potholes to these areas is a good way to enhance wildlife habitat and some other functions of wetlands. Using outside materials to construct wetlands is definitely an option too. Pictured on the left is a group of hardworking wetland training attendees building a wetland with a rubber liner. It's actually sandwiched between protected geotextile. This method is an expensive way to build a small wetland, but in some instances, suitable soils are not available, and the anticipated wetland benefits, in this case, the use of this pool by a nature center for outreach and education, outweigh the additional costs. On the right is another tool that can be used, and that's sheet piling. In this instance, there was a berm that was failing, and there was not native soil available to repair the berm without impacting the existing wetland. So we brought in PVC sheet piling to pound down into the berm and provide an impenetrable layer to keep the water in and not result in too much disturbance of the existing site. This is actually a spot where there was fill placed in a wetland, so that is another way to restore a wetland, is to find an area that was impacted by fill and to remove it. It's a way to definitely ensure that you're going to wind up with a wetland because the hydrology is underneath. And by restoring it, you're returning it to what it once was. And this is a really interesting method of restoring wetlands that I just heard about. It's being used in the Rocky Mountains and west of California, and then even in Canada. They're installing BPDs, or Beaver Promotion Devices, to restore wetlands. California has developed a Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, or California BRAT, that they're using to identify management opportunities. And they're making sure to take into account areas where infrastructure could be impacted and where beavers are most needed. So they've done some really neat GIS analyses to find these areas where the beavers could survive, and where there's enough base flow in the stream to provide habitat, where there's enough vegetation for them to eat, and where they're not going to impact infrastructure. Definitely, we haven't seen any projects like this in the Northeast, but it's something that would be interesting to try. Beavers definitely aren't landowners' favorite mammal, but there's a lot of benefits. Because beavers are considered a keystone species. this interesting poster. Beavers isn't an animal, it's an ecosystem. And beaver dams, according to some of the research they've been doing out west, historically there were so many more beaver dams that really controlled the watersheds in our stream valleys that were reduced because of trapping, really before settlers got to know what a stream valley should look like. And these areas were removed from, beaver dams were removed from them, and streams had already started incising by the time settlers came. So they've been doing some really interesting projects, and you know, they believe that because beaver ponds will impound water, slow runoff, and they increase residents' time of watering the floodplain areas. They raise water tables, and they promote the spread of water across the valley, which increases the water in pore spaces across the valley soil. That building these BPDs and then releasing beavers in some cases to help them restore natural communities is really the most cost-effective way to restore wetlands up there. So we definitely haven't done anything like that, but it would be something we'd love to try if there was a suitable spot. So Usc Wetland Team, we've been working on wetland restoration for 18 years. And since we started, we've actually constructed 240 projects we've assisted with or completed them. And we've constructed over 1,000 wetland pools throughout the watershed and beyond. And we're committed to continuing to advance wetland restoration across the watershed with current funding from New York State DEC Water Quality Improvement Program. We're moving forward with finding and implementing additional sites and raising awareness of other wetland restoration programs to help promote this wetland restoration and increase in our area. I did want to share one more thing. On our website, we have a couple of interesting resources for anyone who's looking to find potential areas that they really like wetlands. On our USC Resources webpage, we've got a Climate Change Resiliency GIS Toolkit where you can download this GIS project file. And there's an awful lot of different opportunities for improving climate change resiliency, and one of those is identifying wetland restoration sites, potential wetland restoration areas. And then on our wetland team page, we actually have data that's a little bit more broad. Really, it's just data by county that identifies areas with suitable soils and suitable slopes that would potentially be areas for wetland restoration. So I wanted to point out those resources. And apart from that, I guess we should see if there's any questions.
Since it's a small group, guys, feel free to unmute yourself to ask any questions, or if you feel like it, you can pop them in the chat as well.
All right, seeing none, everybody can reach me using USC website contact info, and we definitely look forward to continuing wetland restoration across the watershed.
Thanks everybody for participating, and thanks Melissa for presenting. I just want to, I guess, bring your attention to the screen. There's 2 more sessions scheduled for August. Next week is going to be on road ditch management practices and replumbing, and then on August 26th we'll be talking about prioritizing stream culvert projects through multiple data sources. So again, thank you everybody for participating today.